Today I want to talk about some family secrets that involve Mormon Masons. My family, the patriarchy in my family, were Mormon Masons. And I know it's going to be a little bit of a hard subject for me, so I'm holding space with fire. Just wanting to thank Grandmother Fire for holding this space, transmuting anything that I need to send to the fire. A light, a little bit of Palo Santo, to also just clear myself, because I've been thinking about this topic this morning, and I really want to speak from my heart. A lot of the secrets, the things that I'm going to say are, secrets buried in my family, and they're not going to want to be acknowledged by extended family members. But the men that I'm going to talk about are dead, and the abuse that happened, let's put out the fire. I'm going to set you right there. The abuse that happened, was over 50 years ago. And I feel like it's my job to speak the truth about it, because honestly, I don't think there's anyone in my extended family that would step up and say the things that I'm about to say. So a little history about Mormons and Masons before I dive into my family and their connection. Joseph Smith, his connection to Masonry goes, way back to his childhood. His brother, his father were Masons. He kind of grew up with understanding that. And then as he, developed the church, he created the church in 1830. Book of Mormon was in place. Lots of things were in place. That's when the church officially began, April 6, 1830. It wasn't until May of 1842, 12 years later, that Masonic rituals became involved. But Joseph Smith was familiar with Masonry long before the endowment. It wasn't like that just kind of fell in his lap. He was familiar with the stories of Masonry, the Book of Mormon, comparing himself to Enoch. So that's a whole other rabbit hole I want to share at some time. For this, the importance of Joseph Smith and understanding Freemasonry, the early connections of the church, there's 2 points. So Joseph Smith believed he's restoring true Christianity back to the earth. He's restoring what Jesus came and taught and then was lost. That's why it had to be restored. So that was part of his mission, right? He rewrote the Bible because he said it had been translated wrong. So Joseph Smith actually rewrote the Bible, added to it, put the things back that he said were missing. And that's what he did with all of Mormonism. Basically, is Christianity upgraded. He upgraded Christianity, right? Well, he did that for Masonry as well. So he knew about Freemasonry, but in his eyes, he's a narcissistic, power-hungry person here. He's not only restoring Christianity, but he is restoring Masonry. So I have a couple quotes that I want to share. The first one is from Heber C. Kimball. He was a member of the first presidency with Joseph Smith in Nauvoo. He was also a Freemason, became a Freemason before he was introduced to Mormonism. Heber C. Kimball said, "We have true Masonry. The Masonry of today is received from the apostasy which took place in the days of Solomon and David. They have now and then a thing correct," talking about the Freemasons, "but we have the real thing." And that quote comes from Heber C. Kimball and the Family, The Nauvoo Years by Stanley B. Kimball. That idea that Mormons took Christianity and took Freemasonry and then added on and made them true and complete is exactly what I was taught as a child. It might be dying out some with the newer generations that are being raised in the church. I don't know that it's talked about, but for me, growing up as a child in the 70s and the 80s, this idea that Mormons had true Christianity and true Masonry was taught to me, pounded into me, you could say. Another message from the first presidency on October 15th, 1911, they said, "Because of their Masonic characters, the ceremonies of the temple are sacred and are not for the public." So the reason the endowment is considered sacred and secret is because it's Masonic, which it is. It's just interesting that is, you would never hear the first presidency, I think, declare that today. But back in the early 1900s, they're still proud of the fact that they stole Masonry for the temple endowments, and that there is this Mormon and Mason connection. It's interesting. So Joseph became a Mason in March of 1842. And then in May, 7 weeks later, he introduces the endowment. And it's got so many similarities to Freemasonry. In the original endowment, they're swearing blood oaths. My mother swore blood oaths. My grandmother swore blood oaths. My father, my siblings went through the temple before the blood oaths were sworn, or while the blood oaths were being sworn. I went through after. I went in 1991, and these were no longer a thing. The 5 points of fellowship, which is right foot to right foot, knee to knee, we're facing each other out the veil, breast to breast, hand to back, mouth to ear. So you were like literally touching this person on 5 points of your body through the veil. They gave that up also in 1990. Women no longer have to veil their faces in the true order of prayer. And the most recent change to the garments, where women can wear sleeveless clothes, none of these things have all been taken out in the most correct temple ceremony that was handed to Joseph Smith. It's been corrected over and over still today, my point with the garments. To me, these just prove the temple ceremony did not come from God, because he could have done it right the first time. I don't think God needs secret handshakes, tokens, signs, or touching bodies through the veil in order to get into heaven. To me, these are all just examples of it is a man-made religion. And the truth is, it's a family business still today. In the early days of the church, Joseph Smith, his family members, close friends, they were apostles and soon to be prophets. It was literally a family business, and it is still today. There are many people that are related high up in the church. So from the church's website, they say this, quote, historical sources do not explain Joseph Smith's motives for joining the Freemasons. I think we kind of do. No, but going on, but the church says, in many localities in early America, the most important elected officials were also Masons. In joining, Joseph may have assumed that he would gain a network of allies who could give him access to political influence and protection against persecution. After being betrayed by some of his closest associates in Missouri, Joseph may have found Masonry's emphasis on confidentiality and loyalty appealing. Hell yes, Joseph Smith found those things appealing. Confidentiality, keep your secrets, and loyalty, have my back. So, quoting again, in any event, Joseph, like all Masons, would have avowed that his purpose for joining was strictly to gain knowledge and to be of service to others. I call bullshit on that. Continuing, tensions between Latter-day Saints and Masons in Illinois and the surrounding areas continued to escalate. Nauvoo, once Joseph Smith in 1842, remember he's killed in 1844. So in just 2 years' time before he's killed, the Nauvoo lodges of Masonry has grown and is rivaling the regular Freemasons. And if it was just left on its own, absolutely it would have become more influential. And so now in October 1844, this is after Joseph Smith has died, the Grand Lodge severed all ties with the Nauvoo Lodge. This is where Freemasonry and Mormons split apart. And the members of the Nauvoo Lodge. So Nauvoo Masons continued to operate their lodges independently, and the church's website says until 1846, and I'm going to call bullshit again. Again, they're lying by omission, not telling the whole story. And then back to the quotes, it says, when the Saints left Illinois in mass. So they're saying that the lodges stayed open. They're admitting the lodges stayed open until 1846, until they migrated to Utah. After arriving in Utah, Latter-day Saints did not establish new Masonic lodges. Fucking bullshit. They did create Mason. It was not, and to put that in there makes you think the church must think people are really dumb, because here is Freemasonry, such an integral and important part of Nauvoo. Brigham Young takes all the Mormons to Utah, and he's just going to give that up. He's just going to stop being Masons and having lodges. No, they have the true order of Masonry. So now they're just Mormon Masons. They're no longer Freemasons. There's a split. So they are Mormon Masons, and there's a difference. These Utah Masons go underground. So here's where my family kind of comes into play. There's a book. You can find this on the internet still. The book is titled The Relationship of Mormonism and Freemasonry by Anthony W. Ivins. This is my family's copy. This was my grandfather's personal copy. Anthony Ivins wrote this as a rebuttal to a book put out by a Mason titled Mormonism and Masonry. The author of that book was S.H. Goodwin. He wrote that in 1825, and then in 1827 he wrote another one, Additional Studies in Mormonism and Masonry. And his basic argument was that Joseph Smith stole their stuff to use it to create the church. And he's presenting, reasons why he believes this. So this was a rebuttal to the Masons. And this is a picture of the first presidency at the time the book was published. The author was one of these, he was in the first presidency, but died before the book could be completely published. So the first presidency published the book. Heber J. Grant was the prophet at the time that this book was written. The author was a member of the first presidency at the time, but he didn't see it published. It was published in 1934, and he had died by then. So the first presidency publishes the book and then puts a letter in the front of the book to people, mostly bishops, and then signs it to personal friends of the first presidency of the church. And my grandfather was one of these personal friends. Martin Harris is one of the, well, just a minute. Let's see. Okay. One more thing I wanted to point out about this book is that it argues for the ancient origins theory of the Book of Mormon, of Freemasonry, of the temple. So in this book, he is basically arguing that Solomon and David had these ceremonies, had these rituals of Freemasonry, these stories of Freemasonry, and when they apostatized, it was passed person to person down through the line from King Solomon to Joseph Smith. So this theory argues that the Mormon temple ceremonies and the Masonic degrees are both literal descendants from Solomon's temple. They've been passed down person to person by the Masons over the centuries and transmitted to Joseph through heavenly revelations. This theory is usually taken by Mormons that are not Masons. Most of the Nauvoo Mormons believed this theory about Joseph Smith, and that's what it was taught. That's what President, Heber C. Kimball was saying. We have true Masonry. The Freemasons just have pebbles of truth in their Masonry. So the first presidency gave copies with this letter in it to their personal friends. And you can find copies with this letter on eBay. They sell for about $40. This was passed to my father, and then I found it before my father died, and he let me have it as a gift for helping him one day, which I think if he had known the true significance of this book, he never would have given it to me, because I was his ex-Mormon daughter. But we had not had our falling out yet at the time I got this book from him. And then he had forgotten all about it. And so I've kept it. Back to my grandfather. So my grandfather became a bishop at 29. He was in Clarkston, Utah. He owned a farm there. That's mainly his line of work, was farm work. But he was a bishop, so that meant he had to take care of his ward and be there for his ward. Bishops put in. I mean, that's a full-time job. But they're expected to do it on top of their full-time job and on top of taking care of their family. One of my grandfather's job was to build the Martin Harris monument in Clarkston. That is where Martin Harris is buried. And the church, when I grew up, I remember the monument was there long before I was born, but I remember going to the pageant with my family as I got older, sometimes with my friends. It was put on every summer, and it told the story of Martin Harris, who also ended up leaving the church, but the church still celebrates him. I think at the end of his life, he did come back, because that's where he died and buried, was in Utah. So my grandfather was in charge and worked with Heber J. Grant, who was the prophet at the time, worked with him in getting this monument in place. So my grandfather had ties to and a friendship with the prophet of the church. He's 29. That's a really young age for being a bishop. And let's just see if there's anything I wanted to. Nope. At some point in his life, I want to say most likely during this time when he was working with the president of the church to create the monument for Martin Harris, he is introduced to Mormon Masonry and becomes a Mormon Mason. I'm going to say this is rural Utah, right on the border between Utah and Idaho. There are a lot of Mormons who have experienced sexual abuse, and my grandfather was one of the people who's been was accused after his death. This came out after his death, of sexually abusing family members. Our church house, the church house I grew up until it was destroyed in about 1980, 79, 80. I was about 11 years old, right before my grandfather died. I think he died in 1980, I want to say. But it was when my mother passed, which I have talked about several different videos here. I talk about her passing. My mother passed in 2014, and she passed in May, and by October I had been having memories of witnessing sexual abuse in our church house, the church house that was from my youth. And it was like one of those kind of, I would call it more Gothic church houses. They don't build them. Nowadays, the Mormon church is cookie cutter meeting houses. They are all the same. And they're starting to be cookie cutter temples. Like, they're all the same. But in the early church days, right, when there weren't a lot of temples and there weren't a lot of meeting houses, they were unique. And this meeting house was definitely one of those unique, with what we would call secret passageways between classrooms, different, more than one basement, access to the basement. let's just say there was 2 basements. There was one that was connected only through the outside. You couldn't get to it inside the building. And then one in the basement that you could get to, and from inside the main church. And that's the room, both the basement and the very, very top of the church. It was at least 3 stories and multiple levels in this church house. So I started remembering witnessing children being abused in our church house, in the primary rooms upstairs. And I had forgotten all about these memories, but I do remember as a child, I had a really hard time sleeping and had a lot of anxiety as a child. And these experiences that I thought were just maybe dreams as a child were coming back to me as an adult after my mom passed. And I think I could not have gone down this rabbit hole if my mom had been alive. So she was gone, and it was just like the door finally opened and I was able to recall what I had witnessed as a child. I wasn't able to ask the question, well, what happened to me? If I'm seeing this happen to other children, am I really immune, or did this stuff happen to me as well? In 2014, I could not go there, but I was curious as to why these memories were surfacing and the connection to Freemasonry. I helped my father move everything out of my mother's office and put some of his things down. Basically, my mother and father, we traded some things out of her office to kind of make it his space, and that's why I got the book. So the book kind of triggered my curiosity between Mormons and Masons. And today I really wanted to go back and find an article, or find an email that I had, because I reached out to a historian in Utah. I wanted to answer the question, was my grandfather a Freemason? I'm thinking, Freemason like the normal Freemasonry. So at the end of October, I reached out, and it took me a couple hours of searching, but I found our email exchanges. Luckily, I had shared them with one of my sisters, and I will say that most of my extended family, which is a lot of extended people, probably would not agree with anything that I'm saying, especially those that are still Mormon. They probably would not agree that my grandfather sexually abused people in our family. He was, at the end of his life, he was a stake patriarch. Which is a man who channels blessings to all the people in the stake that want one. And my family, so I'm 11, going on 12 when he passes. And before he passed, my parents both really wanted me to get a patriarchal blessing from my grandfather. And with every fiber of my 11-year-old being at the time was like, hell no. Like, my grandfather, that side of the family, my father's father, my father's mother, they were scary people. And, they had 10 children, and a lot of their children had like 9 children and more. So it was huge when that side of the family got together. And I'm not close to any of my cousins on that side. So, yeah, some of the things that I'm going to share about my grandfather would probably be greatly contested by my extended family. I'm just saying that before I reveal what I'm about to say. So, yeah, and the sexual abuse, like, but when I came into the picture, my grandfather was, pretty old. And I didn't witness him abusing anybody. I just know of people who accused him of the abuse. But that's the thing. The witnessing of, I can't recall. The people are like ghosts, or there are figures that are matted out. The children I can see clearly, but not the abusers. So my mother's dead. I'm having these memories. My father gives me this book on Freemasons, and it gets me curious about my grandfather. Was he a Freemason? And it is just a burning. I have to have this question answered. So I reached out to a Freemason historian. I gave him all the information on my grandfather and asked him if he would research, because my grandfather was dead. I told my father that I was doing this, and he was like, yeah, go ahead, do that research. Which I didn't get at the time, but I do understand now. Because he basically knew what I was going to find out. So I called this man that was the historian. This is, of course, 11 going on 12 years ago. 11 years ago. And he said he would do it. He would look and see if he could find my grandfather, any record of my grandfather as connection to Freemasonry in the state of Utah. And so I was thrilled. I was like, that was so nice. And then I did some, research on my own, and I find out about this split between Mormons and Masons. And it is not healed. It is not reconciled until 1980, the year my grandfather dies. So in my mind, I'm like, there's no way my grandfather could be a free Mason, because Mormons and Masons were not allowed in the state of Utah. If you were a Mormon, you could not join a Freemasonic lodge. And according to the church's website, there was no Mormon Masons lodges to join, right? It went underground. So I wrote him an email back, and I said, I'm so sorry, I might be wasting your time, because I just found out this connection. My grandfather was a Mormon. He was, high up. He had been a bishop. He was the state patriarch when he died. I said, I don't think you're going to find him on any of your records, but I appreciate you taking the time to do that for me. Anyways, and he called me on the phone. And then after we talked, he sent me an email. But at the time, I didn't realize the significance of that phone call. And I wish I had it recorded. But I know that he called me so that there would be no traceable record. But he said, I know exactly who your grandfather is. And he said, no, you will not find him on any of the records in the state of Utah. He said there is a chance that he did join a Freemasonic lodge in Idaho, but you would have to call the historian in Idaho, give them the same information, and see if they could find his name. But he said, I know exactly who your grandfather is. And basically told me that what I had suspected was true. That there were a group of Mormon Masons that were not out in the open, in public, but they were absolutely known about by the Freemasons in Utah. and that my grandfather was a high up leader in this organization of Mormon Masons. My grandfather had lost 3 fingers by the time I was born. And yeah, he's a farmer, so that was, an easy cover up. He got it caught in a rope. He got it caught in a tractor. To lose 3, okay, you're either not a very good farmer or very clumsy, or you're lying. And when I remember as a child asking about why Grandpa doesn't have, I think he had 2 on his left hand that was gone, 1 on his right hand. And I remember my grandfather telling me, oh, I just stuck it in a fan. And I knew that was bullshit, even as a child. Like, you didn't just stick your finger in a fan, okay? But he wouldn't tell me the truth. And most of the adults around me wouldn't tell me the truth. And I don't know if I have a cousin alive that could tell me the truth about it. But doing more research down the Mormon Mason rabbit hole, sometimes self-sacrifice for very high leaders is a thing. And I believe that at least one of my grandpa's missing digits was from a self-sacrifice ritual for Mormon Masons, that he was a high up leader. I'm just going to read the email that I got after our telephone conversation with the historian. He said, Miss Garrett, I researched the records of our lodge here in, not going to say where he's at, and found that your grandfather was not a member here. I searched through the records of the Grand Lodge of Utah and found nothing on your grandfather there either. But as I mentioned during our conversation, he may have been a member of the lodge in Malad, Idaho. Tells me the number, and then how to contact Malad, Idaho. But what he told me in that phone conversation made me say, I'm not going to go any further down that rabbit hole to try and find my grandfather, because he answered my main question, which was that there were Mormon Masons, an organization of their own. My grandfather was a part of that. He was a high up individual in that organization. And the reason this is important is because of the stuff I'm going to share about my father and its connection to Mormon Masons. There's a reason our government likes Mormons, because they're obedient. They do what they're told. They have this discipline. And my father was a part of the government. I'm going to share that story in a different video, because this one is mainly about my grandfather. It's basically laying the foundation for my grandfather's secrets, are laying the foundation for my father's secrets. And my father's secrets absolutely have to do with Mormon Masons, the United States government. Most of the people, I would say all probably of the people that I'm going to talk about in the next video, are dead. That's why I feel like I'm not worried about sharing it. So my grandfather, like I already said, my grandfather and grandmother were pretty mean, cold-hearted people who liked power and control. And I only stayed at my grandmother's house once after my grandfather died, because she was a scary, scary freaking woman, except for the children that she liked. There were certain families, certain children of hers and their families that she really, really loved. And our family was not one of them. And it goes back to my father being the oldest son. So it goes back to shit that happened with my father growing up, that we were the unliked family. So yeah, my grandfather and grandmother were not nice people to the commoners. If you were the royal people in our family, then they were loving and wonderful, and those cousins would have no idea of this side of grandma and grandpa that I witnessed my whole life growing up. Like, they were just people you did not want to be around. My other grandma, thank God, was the complete opposite of that. She was my magical fairy tale grandma that saved my life, basically. So my grandfather, they had 12 children. My grandmother had 12 children. One died stillborn. And then the other died at about 18 months in her arms. And that was the son born right after my father. And she had kids like every 2 years. Boom, 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 boom. So the first 5 children, there was 4 girls and my father. And then there was the stillborn baby, and there was the baby that died in her arms. So there's like a good 5-year gap between my father, the first 5 children, and the last 5 children. And the last 5 children were really raised by different parents than the older 5. My father got a very stern father and mother. They had softened a little bit with the younger children of their family. I mean, by the time my mom and dad were married, grandma had her last babies were twins, and they were like maybe a year younger than my mother's first child. So there's a big gap between their oldest child and their youngest. Just like in my family, there's a 20-year gap between my oldest sibling and myself. So my father, I know my father suffered abuse at the hands of his grandfather. His mother's father was an abusive man, which maybe that's why my grandmother was so cold. And then after losing her child, having it die in her arms, I think that was the final nail in the coffin around her heart that she just closed right off. After that, and her cruelty, the stories that got passed down from that side of the family are sad and dark. And I don't think they liked my father exercising a mind of his own. They wanted my father to stay on and take over the family farm. And he knew right from the get-go that was not going to happen. World War II came up, and he enlisted right near the end of it. He was in boot camp for the Navy when Japan surrendered. So his career started in the Navy. His career in the government started in the Navy. And he went to Japan to help with the surrendering and the rebuilding. And then in 1947 is when him and my mother got married. And he went back to school on the GI Bill and got through college, and then went back to California, again working for the government in the naval base there in California. And he came after a couple years there. They had 2 kids there, and his father, my grandfather, wanted him back in Utah. So he did get a job at Hill Air Force Base, which is still a military base here in Utah, in Ogden. That's not where my grandfather wanted my father to be. And they did everything in their power to try to manipulate my dad. But my dad always found a way around their manipulations. He was very, very headstrong. But it was while he was at Hill Air Force Base that he came in contact with Mormon Masons that were not under his father's umbrella. And that is where my father's story and secrets come into play. We're talking 1951 through 1990s. His career and secrets, I'll talk about them next time. So I just kind of have laid this foundation. The main thing I wanted to put out today was the understanding that Mormons and Masons split because of Joseph Smith, and they didn't come back together until 1980. And it was 2016 before a Mormon was elected in a normal Freemason lodge as a Grand Master. Like, that was a big deal in Utah. I remember when that came out because I put it in my book. This idea that a Mormon got to be a high-level Freemason, because up until 30 years ago, 40 years ago, they weren't allowed to cross secret societies. And that's the other thing I'm going to say about Mormonism. It is a fucking secret society that started with blood oaths. You had to swear on your life that you would keep their secrets. Mormonism is a secret society, which is so ironic because, mainstream Mormons are told not to join secret societies, but they are in one. They're already in one. That's why they don't want you joining others. Mormonism is a secret society. There is such thing as Mormon Masons, and they are not mainstream Freemasons. That was confirmed to me by a Freemason, which he was only willing to tell me that over the phone. He was not willing to write it on anything that could be traced. And my grandfather was a part of that Mormon Masonry, a high-up leader. That was the shadow that my father was raised under. And my grandfather was accused of sexual abuse. And so in 2014, last thing I'll share, in 2014, when I had this conversation with my, with the Mason historian, and I'm having these suppressed memories resurface, I decided to reach out to a hypnotherapist that I trusted and kind of had met about a year before. I reached out to him and worked with him about these memories. And then it branched off into other things. But what I was able to, one of the pieces that I'll share was that absolutely ritualistic, what I would call satanic, because it was the worship of Lucifer, which they refer to as Satan. I think that's a little mixed up, but I'm not going to dive into that. The point was they thought they were worshiping the adversary. That's probably the best word for it. I did witness those rituals take place in the basement of the church, the LDS church that I grew up attending, until it was destroyed. And I think there's a reason it was destroyed. I don't know what year it was built. Probably more modern than I don't know. That's a good question. I should look and see if I could find that information when that church was built. Like I said, it It had a Gothic feel inside. I guess maybe as a child too, that's how my memories are of it. It was a dark church house. It wasn't inviting. And it was like a maze inside, multiple levels, little secret passageway upstairs. It was unique. You would think a church like that would be historical in value and not torn down. The churches like that from the city that I grew up in were sold or destroyed. The one church that is still old and significant got sold to a Catholic church and now it has a cross on it, but it's not destroyed. The one I grew up in and remember these rituals and sexual abuse of other children got destroyed. Same year my father died. Grandfather. That happens to me. I do have dyslexia, and so I will mix up words in sentences. My grandfather. Same year my grandfather died. The church was destroyed. Or rebuilt. It could have been destroyed the year before. My memory's a little foggy, but those are the takeaways to next time when I share the next piece of the story, starting with my father. And Hill Air Force Base. I'll stop there. Yeah, just leave it there for next time. There's a reason Mormons and Masons, Mormons were hated by the true Freemasons for a really long time because Joseph Smith stole their stuff, created a church because he didn't want to work. He didn't want to be a farmer. He didn't want to earn a living that way. And being a preacher was a hell of a lot easier than plowing a field. And I believe that 100%. This church was created as a family business. And when he died, it, created a split. Died, murdered. I think Brigham Young's got dirty hands, blood on his hands with Joseph's demise. But that's a topic for another time. So yeah, Mormons and Masons go way back, hand in hand. And Mormonism did not just erase its Freemason roots when they came to Utah. I would say today it's probably still alive and well. I mean, I have no proof of that, but I know my father was a Mormon Mason and he died 2017. And I think people stepped in and filled in those shoes that my husband, or sorry, not my husband, my father and my grandfather wore. Okay, I'm done for today. That's enough. Thanks.